Hey everyone, I think it's about time to call this meeting to order. Welcome to the latest installment of the Non-Degree Credentials Research Network NCRN webinar series. Today's conversation is a really special one. This really builds on some of the conversations we had at our spring meeting back in May at George Washington University, where we were talking about what some of the recent political developments have mean for the work that we do on non-degree credentials. And of course, short-term Pell or workforce Pell has been on everyone's mind, especially since that beautiful bill act passed over the summer. So we thought that this would be a good opportunity now to reflect on what do we know about non-degree credentials and how they might relate to that workforce Pell, and what would our research agenda look like? What can we do as a community? What do we already know that might inform the policy discussions about how workforce Pell is going to be implemented? What do we need to know? And also, how might we learn what we need to know? So with that in mind, we invited two speakers who gave excellent insights at that NCRN meeting conference in the spring and who are here to tell us a little bit more, go into some more detail about what they know and what their research tells us and their views, and then we'll go into a broader discussion. So I would like to welcome both Harry Holzer. Harry is a professor of public policy at Georgetown University, and Jinan Bittar, who is the director of higher education research and data analytics for the Education Trust. Um, so without further ado, actually, I'm not quite positive. We had an order in mind? I think Harry, you might be going first.
Yes, I think I'm first.
Yes, go. Well, go ahead,
Okay.
Harry.
Thank you very
Thank
much,
you.
Kyle. And it's very nice to be here to talk about what has become a pretty major change for those of us who think about higher education and the job market. So let's talk a little bit about workforce Pell and what it should mean for colleges and workers. And as Kyle said, what do we know now and what do we need to still learn? Next slide, please. So Workforce Pell was passed as part of the One Big Beautiful tax bill. We know it provides Pell eligibility for a range of short-term for-credit programs that were not eligible before the bill passed, and also some not-for-credit programs. Of course, there's a bunch of hoops that both of those sets of programs need to jump through and the not-for-credit even a little more in terms of average earnings and job placement rates. And the not-for-credit programs, of course, have to somehow be part of a pathway to for-credit credentials. For obvious reasons, I think the eligibility of the not-for-credit programs is more tentative than those for the short-term credit for a variety of reasons that I'll mention. Next slide, please. So what we all care about at the end of the day is the extent to which people will gain higher ed credentials, and ultimately, what will those mean in the labor market, and how much will it improve their labor market outcomes? I think there's four issues that to me are very important. And then the question is, what's the evidence? How much evidence do we have to date on those four questions? The first is simply which programs will meet the various criteria for coverage. We'll be able to jump through those hoops and meet the required criteria. Secondly, once programs have become eligible, how will people's enrollment patterns change? To what extent will enrollment grow in the newly eligible programs, and where will that enrollment come from? Third, what are the economic returns to students and workers who gain the new credentials, and how do they compare to people to a whole range of other credentials? These are the incentives, but also the impacts on the ultimate outcomes. And then lastly, what's the context in which all of this is happening? What other broader economic and institutional changes will be happening? And in fact, I'm going to argue that those broader economic and institutional changes might well swamp the first three set of factors in terms of importance, although we're not sure yet. So next slide, please. Next slide. There. So first of all, which programs will meet the eligibility criteria? First of all, this starts on the availability of data to sort of show what are the returns for these programs. And the data availability in a lot of cases are unclear, especially for the not-for-credit programs. There are many colleges in many states that have not traditionally collected these data. And we know iPads doesn't collect the data either for the not-for-credit programs. Of course, now there's a much bigger incentive for the institutions or the states to collect those data. I believe they will respond to those incentives and start collecting, but at what speed? How long will it take them to get those systems up to snuff? But two other issues that are worth mentioning. We researchers have some real questions about these criteria, like on average, making sure people earn more than high school graduates in the region. Most of us prefer some kind of measure of value added rather than a certain level. So, for instance, if someone's earning $15,000 a year after they've gotten a credential, and that's substantially lower than the average earnings of a local high school graduate, the value added might still be high if they were only earning 8 or 10,000 before they got that credential. All of a sudden, the returns to the credential seem larger. So we have some complaints against those level-based accountability measures, and they create another problem. They created an incentive for colleges to cream skim to improve their numbers. Now, all of these programs, by and large, have mostly been open enrollment to date, certainly the not-for-credit programs. Will that continue to be the case if colleges think they need to improve what their numbers look like in these programs? Next slide, please. Will the enrollment patterns change? All else equal, in any given program that becomes newly eligible for this aid, we expect rising enrollment. Not sure how much, not sure exactly which programs will see enrollment rise, and from whom and which populations will we see those new enrollees coming from? If they are coming from people who are currently non-enrolled, most of us will consider that a good thing. And these people will now gain credentials they didn't have and higher labor market earnings to some extent. If they are coming from people currently enrolled in longer term for credit certificates or degree programs, it's not clear that they'll be better off. They might have lower costs in the short term, but the returns also might be lower. And the changes in those enrollments will also affect the completion rates and the earnings we see for people in those programs. So whatever evidence we have today on the returns might change if the enrollment rates change a good deal over time. Next slide. So a really key question is, what are the returns for students and workers when they earn these new credentials and bring them to the labor market with them? There is a lot of evidence to date on for-credit short-term programs. Some of that evidence comes from administrative data that have been newly available, say in the last 15 years, some of it from survey data. Obviously, we have less evidence for the not-for-credit programs, although that body of evidence is growing. And before I very, very quickly summarize what I think those studies show, I want to point out that there's actually different approaches, different empirical approaches to estimating these rates of return. And they're really kind of apples and oranges. And yet people often don't take the time to point this out. And I have a discussion of this in my relatively new paper, Workforce Development in the US. It's an IZA discussion paper, and will be out next year in the Journal of Economic Literature. There's an older approach that those of us who are a little older, we were schooled in running log earnings regressions, the old-fashioned Becker-Mincer format. And you would simply look at the returns for people with various college credentials relative to people with high school diplomas or GEDs. Many analysts have pointed out there might well be some bias, upward bias in those estimates because you can't control for maybe differences in basic abilities, cognitive or non-cognitive abilities that the people who obtain those credentials have relative to those who don't. There's a newer approach, almost exclusively among people who have been using these state level administrative data on higher ed, where you compare people completing a community college credential to enrollees in community college who are non-completers. I believe there's likely a negative bias in those estimates, especially if those non-completers piled up some significant credits and have some significant earnings. Important to keep both methods in mind. Next slide, please. Well, what does the evidence actually show to date, despite those different kinds of estimate? My reading of this literature is that on average, the short-term for-credit programs that will become newly eligible for Pell create earnings gains on the order of 10% or a bit higher, maybe 10 to 15% relative to people just out of high school. The non-credit programs, again, depending on how you estimate them, I think are coming in a bit lower than that at 5 to 10% compared to either high school or community college non-completers, but there's very high variance across the different fields of study, across the different programs, and across the states. And for instance, in California, the very short-term for-credit programs gain a quite nice return, and in Kentucky, they don't, even when you have exactly the same data and exactly the same analytical methods. So a lot of variance across that. And I want to highlight three fairly recent papers that I think provide evidence either of the short-term for credit or the non-credit. So the first one is an Urban Institute report that I wrote with Sandy Baum and Grace Lutmer in 2020. We use ATES data. That's a one-time survey called the American Training and Education Survey, people's respective answers to credentials they had earned, long-term or short-term, for credit, not for credit. And we found on average, about 6% return for non-credit credentials, and for short-term for credit, 12, 13% on average. The next two papers by D. Shu, looking at the Fast Forward program in Virginia, and by Barr in Columbus, using data from a number of states, they use the administrative data, they use the newer methods, but they still come out in that 5 to 10% range. Shu finds the Fast Forward program creates an earnings return of about 10%, and Barr and Columbus, on average, find a 5% return, again, with a lot of variance across the fields, et cetera. So I think we know about that, but we have to keep estimating more of those numbers in more places and see if they change over time. Next slide, please. So having said all that about the different issues and the different things to keep in mind, all of those changes are going to be occurring in a particular context in which local and regional economies are changing and in which institutions like community colleges are changing as well, even without workforce Pell. Let me just highlight a few of those things. First of all, there have been trends in enrollment patterns that a lot of us have been following broadly in certificates, but also associate degree programs, bachelor's and higher. Enrollment has mostly been declining, certainly since the pandemic, but for associate degrees, even going back to 2010, they bumped up a lot right after the Great Recession. The numbers have been better. They've been rising for short-term, what we might call the career and tech ed programs, whether they're for credit or not. We don't know if these trends were cyclical because the job market was very strong, so people were enrolling less, or it could be a secular decline. There has been growing disenchantment with the costs of college and the returns, and there's a lot of talk about skills-based hiring rather than credentials-based hiring. I think so far it's mostly been talk, but we'll see how that goes over time. But then there's three really important economic forces that I think will affect all of these numbers. First of all, are we about to have a big labor market downturn? If we have a labor market downturn, will it be a big one or a small one? Downturns on average tend to raise enrollment because the opportunity cost of not being in the labor market goes down. When that happens, that usually is a bigger positive bump for the degree programs than the short-term certificates, but we'll see. We'll see whether that happens. The second one, of course, is the patterns that regions and industries through which those regions and industries are growing and what they mean for places like community colleges or other institutions. Especially if you're looking at deindustrialized regions, which industries are growing in their place, exactly what kind of skills are the employers they're looking for, and the extent to which community colleges are responding to them. And again, and what's the interaction between economic development and higher ed? That's very important. And then, of course, the third force is AI. Well, who even knows how that's going to change skill demands and skill needs? We all know it will likely be important. We simply don't know in which direction for this short-term certificate population and for other groups. And lastly, separately from those economic forces, a lot of the community colleges are changing on their own, invoking all kinds of new innovations in how they structure these programs and how they finance them. I think the best summary of some of the innovations is in a book in Higher Ed Press by Bob Schwartz and Rachel Lipson in 2023. Full disclosure, I wrote the foreword for that book. But they point out all the new and creative ways that colleges are trying to stack their not-for-credit programs into for-credit credentials, all kinds of new ways of trying to finance them, provide financial aid. And then, of course, there's a whole new body of approaches separate from the community colleges. We often call them the talent finance programs, income share agreements, outcome-based loans, where basically you lend people money for higher ed, and they don't have to pay it back until their earnings have gone up by a pretty substantial amount. It takes a lot of the risk out of those investments for the individuals and realigns the quality incentives in a good way. Anyway, these are all the things that matter. We'll see. We'll see how much difference the workforce Pell programs make, and we'll see these other contextual factors. What direction do they go in, and how all those things interact to impact the outcomes that we all care about. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Larry. And I think we're taking questions at the end, Kyle. Is that?
Yes, that's right. So you can go ahead. Go ahead.
To keep you burning questions, we'll get to them.
Okay.
Again, my name's Janan Bitar, and I serve as the Director of Higher Ed Research and Data Analytics for EdTrust National Team here in Washington, D.C. So if you could go to the next slide for us, and maybe even the next slide. Awesome. So for folks who are not familiar with EdTrust, we're a national nonprofit working to ameliorate the barriers and challenges, particularly for students from low-income backgrounds and students of color across the education to workforce spectrum, meaning P-12 through college or other post-secondary options. And my research team had been really interested in, some of the conversations about the increased interest in short-term and non-degree credentials. And, I think many folks have heard me say this. I was being a little facetious at first. I heard a lot about short-term credentials. Oh, they're cheaper. And I just thought, are they cheaper? Or are they shorter? And we also heard a lot about they're really getting popular. And I'm like, by what data? So that's sort of what guided our initial inquiries. And the first thing we wanted to do was better understand the costs as part of a broader effort to understand the value. So if you could hit the next slide, please. So in the next 10 minutes or so, we're just going to take a look at the most recent short-term credential cost data my team has, review some other enrollment trends data, and discuss a little bit about what's next. Go to the next slide. Awesome. So the first thing to understanding costs is we didn't want to just, look at the individual costs of programs. We really wanted, if we were taking serious that working learners and students are trying to understand the costs across a spectrum of what their options are. We know that 2- and 4-year colleges and programs already have what they call a cost of attendance, which has both direct and indirect costs that would often be assumed by the student over the course of the program. And so we wanted to create something similar for short-term credentials so that we could really be comparing, apples to apples. And so as you can see here, it's very similar to other cost of attendance calculations you may have seen that include things like tuitions and fees and books and supplies, and then adds on things like the living expenses. We calculated this over different durations of time for comparison, and we calculated over both an academic 9-month and 12-year calendar. And if folks want to know more about the deeper methodology of it, please do ask about what we used and that sort of thing. But for now, we'll go to the next page here. That means that with our great partners at Credential Engine, we chose to work with Credential Engine as a national org looking at federal policy outlay. It was really important for us to sort of have a national landscape of data for that conversation. And so we got access to the back end of Credential Engine and ended up with about 43 states, just under 20,000 credentials across 12 credential types. And for the purposes of our study, we were just looking at programs 1 year or less. And then we divided academic and providers and workforce providers dependent on if they were listed in IPEDS. We know there may be a handful of like NDC or people reporting, but it's less than 1%. So that's how we split the academic and workforce providers to really compare the costs. So the next one should get us to some of those summaries. And I definitely encourage for all of the data that I'm talking about today, feel free to check out our public Tableau site. We have all the data here in the cost of attendance inquiry, as well as the enrollment inquiry I'm going to discuss listed on that site. So what did we learn? Well, just like Harry said, the cost of attendance or cost varies really significantly among credential types. And so I don't think that's probably a surprise to anyone. I think we can jump right to finding number 2. What I did find really interesting, though, is when we compared the cost of tuition against the cost of attendance, what we found was that workforce providers actually generally lowered a total tuition than academic providers. So if you can see the slope of the line for academic training, it's much steeper than the workforce programs. And I just say this is going to be something to watch as Workforce Pell unfolds, right? Because the question is, does tuition increase as access to federal dollars increase? Hard to say, which what feels kind of like a cost ceiling in the requirements. And I'd also just flag for folks, an increase might not necessarily mean frivolous inflation. It might mean, quality program improvements that they have not been able to previously make. So next slide, please. So we really wanted to understand if you were someone who might be looking at a short-term credential program in your state, how would you determine if it was affordable for you? And so we compared that hourly cost against the minimum wage. And the cost of short-term credentials per hour often exceeds the minimum wage in most states. You'll see our team often uses shorthand sort of colloquial ways of finding costs that people might use. And I know myself have asked myself many times, if I wanted to afford X, how many hours would I have to work? And so it's a little easier to see in the next slide, actually, just how many hours that would take in each state on average. And what that left our team knowing is not necessarily a position on who should cover the cost or how the cost should be covered, but that based on what we're seeing in the preliminary data, workers and learners are going to need more financial assistance to access these types of credentials and programs. So the who and how is up to you all and everyone. But what we know is if these are going to be targeted to help working learners upskill or to try to move folks from low-income communities to living wages, they're going to need financial assistance. And I think you go to the next one. Okay, so that's the recap of the work we did on the cost credentials. But I wanted to also flag, I mentioned we took a look at the enrollment data as well, because I was sort of curious if the hype was matching the data. And so our team analyzed the last 6 years of National Student Clearinghouse data, and we really wanted to understand state by state and demographic trends. And when we did that work, what we realized was that there's still a really strong culture of college going, four-year college going among Black and Latino students, particularly at public four-year universities. And that, as Harry had alluded to, there's still a strong drop in associate's degree programs across quite a few states. We didn't see so much movement in the sub-bac section, which would include these short-term credentials. And I think there's a couple reasons why. One, a lot of the movement is really dependent on state and what they're doing in the state. So nationally, it might be kind of look null, but there is movement in directions at the state level. I also think you have to acknowledge that at the moment, the National Student Clearinghouse data probably doesn't do the best job of representing all of those programs at the moment. And I know they're obviously in works with a lot of partners to improve that, but there's probably just a lot of short-term non-degree credentials not represented in this data. But what that does leave our team to think, this isn't causal research by any means, but what feels a little more clear is that the value of this traditional college degree conversation might be a little different for students of color. And that also, it seems that folks that are on their pathway to a 4-year program are not necessarily going, should I do this 8-week program or go to my 4-year college? It seems like there's a lot more choice considerations happening below that sub-bac level. Should I go to my local community college for an associate's degree, or do I go to this industry recognized 16-week program, right? So that's a little bit about what we learned from that enrollment inquiry. And we have a couple new things coming up, one of which is a state AIDS project scan. So scanning all 50 states just to better understand which state aid programs actually provide funding to short-term and non-degree programs, either directly or indirectly, right? To institutions for the programs or to the students. And so I won't just read off all of the information from the original scan, but what I will say is a lot of states are putting support into these bins and buckets. In fact, over 30 of these states and programs covered costs beyond tuition and fees, meaning those other costs associated with completing a program are important to those serving the students in their state. Oh, we can go next one. Yeah, awesome. So we did the cost inquiry. We took a look at enrollment. We're running a scan of which state aid can be used towards these programs and credentials. But really across this work, there are a couple main takeaways. One is that more data is needed to understand the cost and value of these credentials. And I think in an attempt to roll out Workforce Pell, this is really an opportunity for states to think about how they can build more robust data systems and maybe have data sharing agreements across not only just institutions, agencies, but maybe across state lines. And that program quality can really be prioritized if folks have buy-in. So not only do we have the data, but that we're using that data responsibly and getting it to the people who need it in a timely manner to make decisions, making sure it's disaggregated in ways that's contextual to your states or regions. And make sure you're using partners to assure quality frameworks. So I think there are a lot of takeaways, and I'm actually just going to re-up Harry's questions because I think those are absolutely the right questions for people following this natural experiment to ask themselves as we roll out towards implementation for their goal date of July 2026. So we're going to want to know who's meeting the criteria, and on the policy side, we're going to understand who's making those decisions. We're going to want to understand how this impacts enrollment, but more than that, for who. Want it disaggregated. We're going to want to understand the value, and there are a lot of people and partners digging into those questions. And then really understand how this is happening in a broader context. So I know for us, like one of my main concerns is that what we do know about short-term credentials, non-degree credentials during the Workforce Pell rollout doesn't actually mitigate that this is happening during a time where there's extremely reduced capacity across federal and state agencies to do this work. So I appreciate y'all for your time listening to this, and I'm really excited to dig into the convo.
Thank you, Jianan. That's all really interesting. I You actually kind of provide a segue into one of the questions that I wanted to ask, which was about how we're in this time where there's all these kind of threats to federal data infrastructure. We hear, not great things coming out of the Department of Education these days in terms of the continuity, both on the survey research side, real it, we're all kind of trying to figure out now what's left of NCES, what's left of the State Longitudinal Data Systems program. And feel free to share any gossip. Anybody can share any gossip they've heard about what might be going on with what remains of, our federal statistical system. But I'm kind of was wondering if you could say a little bit more on that thread of how it does seem like we I guess my question is, are the SLDSs that we have, state longitudinal data systems, are they useful? Are they going to be useful? And will they con if there's not going to be more federal investment in the short to medium term, at least in those state data systems, what what can we do to what are the next best sources of data? Are there good alternative sources of data that we should be looking to?
I don't know. Harry, do you want to kick off? Do you want me to kick it off? Not you.
Janana, you might
Yeah.
have more close to the ground stuff, but and I'll
Um,
after
well,
you.
Kyle, I mean, for I guess for inside baseball, I think there's plenty of people on. I'm seeing names on this call that would know this. You know, they're the head of or interim of IES. The admin brought in someone, Amber Northern, to sort of talk to folks, conduct stakeholder interviews, and provide their report of how they might move forward with IES. I
Hmm.
think you saw they just closed their comments on this too. So she also, and the group also asked for comments from folks about, re-envisioning IES. What we don't know is like what will happen with that information, how seriously the admin will consider what's written in it and how it'll be used to implement a new version of IES, whether her report or the comments. And unfortunately, we're in a place where the harm for the data systems hasn't quite arrived yet, right? So we know that basically all of the major consulting firms and agencies that ran these really important data collections have been riffed or their contracts have been canceled. But we haven't come to the place yet where like iPad's data is missing or NAEP scores are not being collected or so the harm isn't there, but for most of us who understand how these collections work, like we can't quite fathom how they would happen without these more robust contracts or agency staff in place. So I'll leave it at that. I think then that really gives states the opportunity to say to take the lead and say their own data is important and actually own their own data, right? Versus it being just a reporting component to the federal government. Really take this opportunity to think about how they want their state data to be collected, run, who owns it, what are their data governance structures and compliance rules, what are their state constitutions and legal mandates, and own this data for their states. And I think that's the opportunity. Where they're getting the capacity is kind of beyond me, I'll be honest, Kyle.
And I'll just throw in a word about the state longitudinal data systems. Um, I think the states have invested a great deal in those, and I think the states, of course, with federal assistance, I think they are so valuable to the states, and I think the states view them as important so that their own students and the education practitioners know what's the return to different kinds of curricula, different kinds of programs, and so I'm guessing the vast majority of states will want to maintain that, even if it's somewhat more costly for them to do so, and especially as we're entering an AI world where potentially some of these returns might get scrambled. I think the states aren't going to want to walk away from one of their best data sources on what's going on at their institutions.
That's actually somewhat encouraging, I think, that, uh, and that does point to the role of states in kind of charting their own outcomes. Another thing I've heard, is that states are in different places in terms of how would they make students aware? How are they going to recruit? How are they going to support institutions? And states might be in different places and how they're going to, how prepared they are to really leverage this new source of this new stream of potential revenue for some or potential support for some students. Um, so another question I wanted to throw out, you can each kind of take this how you will, but if you want to play fantasy grant maker, and you each had, hypothetically, let's say, unrestricted grant, $1 million from a foundation fund or somebody who really wanted to understand what's going on. How can we really evaluate and understand and learn some lessons that would support the implementation of short-term Pell? What would you, short-term and workforce, I'm using the terms interchangeably, they've been used quite a bit over the years. What would what would be your priority? What would be your pitch, I guess, for a research project that we could potentially put in the field the next year and really advance our understanding of what the effects of this new program will be?
I would spend the money on technical assistance to the states as they get their not-for-credit data up and running, because in so many places they only have the for-credit data, and we're going to need it for the not-for-credit side if you're going to want to have those programs become eligible for Workforce Pell. And what you want is not just to help them get the data, but with the same kind of consistency and quality standards across states. So I think that would be my number one priority, and I'm guessing among many people on the call as well.
And Cotton, I love that, Larry. I would just almost double down on Harry. I could tell you 20 studies I'd love to see, but I double down on Harry, like more concerted interest in understanding the stackability component of that. So first you need the data, right? As Harry's talking about, and states are going to need technical assistance to develop those, interoperable data systems to understand outcomes. A lot of states are collecting data in a way that they can answer some simple questions that they might internally be interested in, but not in a way that they could do like comparisons or analysis or better understand outcomes. But I think that really understanding how those non-degree credentials turn into stackable pathways is going to be really difficult work for states. So I think that's something I'd love to see more investment in. Yeah,
So I would
Charles
like to open the
has a comment.
conversation up to our audience. We have 75 of you on the call, which is fantastic, by the way. So I did want to start. I'm kind of going through the chat we have here. There's actually a lot of links here to different articles, pieces of research that have been done. So I encourage everyone to go through. I'll definitely be opening these all up in a separate browser window to read right after this call. But I do see Cheryl Bailey. You've made a comment here about the high cost of four-year degrees. Cheryl, I'll invite you to come off mute if you want to say a little bit more about your question.
Good afternoon. Yes, yes. I wasn't prepared to be on camera. I've been researching since early morning, and so I'm looking like a researcher at her desk, which is not camera ready. So good afternoon. My question is related to the significant high cost of the four-year degree that has now been shifted to the individual student and their families. And many families, we are finding, are just running out of funds before the student can finish the four-year degree. And that has led to this significant question amongst many families, does the four-year degree cash flow? Is it worth the investment? Now, of course, our research shows yes, eventually, but they may say like Keynes, well, in the long run, we're all dead. And so therefore, that long run return, they can't see that when they're trying to make that work. And having a grandson in college and seeing what my son and my daughter-in-law are going through, I'm like, this is not sustainable for most families. And of course, grandparents are pitching in. And so, especially with another child in private school. So, this is just not something, this is not a way to produce a productive workforce. And especially with AI and the knowledge industry being so much of a growth factor for the future. So the question is, can these credentials, these short-term credentials, give these individual students and families, what does the data show? Some some sort of return. They can see their way, they can actually earn some money, but also be a pathway to the four-year degree where they will have greater career options, longevity. But many times they just could only see their way to the first job, not to the 10th job. And so just want to say, what does the research show as we can create some pathways for people in the workforce, people in the higher ed, to actually have some sustainable education to carry them in their degrees, the degrees and what they need to be fully participant in the economy of the future.
I'll take a first crack at that, and I want to take an opportunity to say hi to Cheryl. We
Yes.
were friends who went to graduate school together. I won't tell you how many years ago, but it's nice to hear your voice, and I hope we catch up soon. And Cheryl, everything you said, of course, is correct. For families that aren't quite eligible for financial aid or enough financial aid, that they face their own liquidity constraints. Uh, they have mixed ability to borrow on the market, and they're risky investments, especially for people who don't finish. Having said all that, you're right that the research still says it's a worthwhile investment. Although, there's some larger looming questions for brand new college graduates. We see their unemployment rates rising. There's some evidence, maybe, that AI is eliminating sort of early work experience programs, making it harder to get hired for the first time. So, and if, there's all this buzz about skills-based hiring, a lot of companies talk about it, putting less weight on the actual college credential, that would reduce the returns to the credential. But again, mostly now it's still mostly talk, and they have more observability of the underlying skills, but not that much more. So I say on net, it's still a decent investment for most, although I think people want to start paying more attention to the subfields that are paying off in the labor market, and not assuming that all of them are. And AI could completely reshuffle that deck for us, and we'll see how that goes. But still, people who right now have plans to go to 4 year, you don't want to encourage them not to. And I worry a little bit about, people, this whole trend towards free community college, which some states have undertaken. The feds have backed off of that. I always worry that, if people who used to go to a 4 year, if they now started a 2 year, their ability to make the transition from 2 year to 4 year is more questionable. And some people might get lost in that shuffle between them. I think the short-term stuff is really important for people who are either not enrolled right now or enrolled in something short-term that doesn't have much labor market value. And that's, of course, where the data come in, that Janan and I both talked about, the importance of having clear, and I love Janan's point about having data on what stacks to what, and the extent to which people are doing. That's a very important point for this whole conversation. Um, but we need good data and good analysis so we can provide the right kind of guidance to those students. I wrote a paper with Zayu Shu a number of years ago. He's at the Calder Center at AIR, and we found just the extent to which students, they do so much uh, switching across programs when they get there and they find out that some of the programs are much harder to finish than they realize. And I mean, there's some, you gain information when you switch, but there can be large costs to that. The guidance needs to be stepped up, and it can only be effective based on really good data and really good analysis. So I think all of that, we don't want people not to go to 4 year if they can do it, but we do have to provide a more robust set of pathways there and elsewhere, and really emphasize the programs with strong returns.
Yeah, I mean, Harry's right on the mark there. I think the overarching thing is the data still overwhelmingly suggests the bachelor is the most effective path to social mobility. And I think that there's a lot of caveats there, right? That's if you complete, that's if you can wait out working entry level right after you finish, with no support after you finish this program, and get through to that next, like, probably career trajectory role, right? So I think it's especially hard in today's economy for younger folks. I'm thinking of, like, I'm not in that category, but I got my bachelor's, and my first salary, full-time salary outside of it was $26,000 a year. I think I looked at the real dollars today, it was about 40K. And I don't think that's wild for a starting point today for students in reality. But I think that 40K today is a completely different living scenario. So I think it's important to know, like, it's still the best pathways, but students today are competing against a different market. And I also think really important that Harry pointed out, like a lot of investments to try to get people to the workforce quicker don't necessarily end up giving a better lifetime career trajectory of earnings for those students. And that's when we see like investments in 2-year promise programs. Maybe that would be fine if there was more intention in that stackability to the 4-year degrees, if there was maybe more like a guarantee, direct admissions to 4-year programs. Otherwise, you're sort of just limiting and stratifying options for students by providing funding for one type of credential over the other. And we see those sort of decisions happen with things like the Louisiana TOPS. Students realizing they can get more money out of pocket to go to a 2-year program than a 4-year program, right? And I think the biggest thing is like no one gets any of these realized gains, again, if you go back to this, if they don't complete. And so there does need to be a large focus on how many students are getting through these programs. And then what kind of alignment they have with the labor market, because we'll see, institutions set up programs and not even take simple steps like review eligibility requirements of that professional field and notify students of those things. And what I mean by that is, should someone be just as impacted, like not having them do a whole entire program to realize they can't actually get that licensure, right? That happens sometimes. I always say the stackability is a myth, but I do have one example is from the College of Healthcare Professions in Texas, and I like them because they have data to show the improvement of outcomes for their students, but their short-term credentials are stackable, and they have evidence to show it. And so I think it's really important that in this endeavor, we better understand how these pathways connect together. Oh, my final pitch is the data has to be disaggregated. So no matter what we're doing, like if you're part of a group of, students as a population, whether that's students of color, Black students, disabled students, vets, you often see these median and average numbers and they don't really pertain to you. So a lot of times it's not that students are doubting the value of college, it's that we haven't done a good job of demonstrating what the value is for someone like them.
Thanks, Gina. That's really a strong claim that stackability is a myth, but I actually, it's an interesting point, certainly. Um, so I do want to keep us moving through some of the comments. Great questions are coming up in the chat. Julie, I have a feeling I know the answer to your question, but I'm going to defer to the panelists. Julie, Uranus, if you want to come off mute and say a little bit about your question about credential value lists, feel free.
Sure. So, with the development of tools like what we see from Burning Glass Institute and others that are establishing, these credentials of value and determining the value of these credentials, we know that that's going to be an important criteria for establishing eligibility for Pell, workforce Pell, is each state will establish a list. And so I'm interested in knowing if anybody's doing any research on the methodology behind the lists. Is it purely earnings? We know that it's problematic for high demand, low wage positions like social work and childcare. And, there's a potential disconnect there. And so I'm curious if anyone's doing any research on the methodology behind the establishment of those lists.
I think it's something that researchers, both in academia and outside, have been talking about and thinking about for a long time. And certainly that whole body of literature that was based on when the state longitudinal data systems became available, starting around 2010 or so, has wrestled with that issue. Also, Sandy Baum at the Urban Institute and some of her co-authors have a very nice new paper. I think it's not released yet. It'll be out fairly soon, wrestling with the question of how do you do accountability correctly? What else besides the earnings? How much you think of other measures of social value? And of course, the notion that if value added is in fact much better than a flat level, how might you incorporate some of that stuff? So I think there's a lot of talk and a lot of interest, and any ideas you might have. Well, I think you're raising a very important question. You want to make sure people are doing it the same way, so it means the same thing. And again, I've worried about if these programs start cream skimming, as they have some incentive to do, just to get their numbers to look better. We have to pay attention to that. So I think both the data and the research going forward on that are very important. But your point that there is social value not fully captured by earnings is a very important one. And maybe we need some agreement on a list of what are those occupations that have significant non-pecuniary social value, and what should we do about them?
I'm both presenting and taking notes because there's great conversation going on. And I think it's, Harry and I apparently are on the same page, even though we didn't really have a full-on conversation about this before today. But I think who's taking a look, I do think there are quite a few people looking at this. I know EdTrust ourselves are very interested and closely following this authorization process in the states. I think we're both interested in the who and what. So who's going to be involved in it? Like obviously legislation as it stands, it's with workforce boards. Things could happen in Regneg coming up in December, January, but who else will they include? Will the governor's office ask different components to have a say? SHIOs, education agencies, someone in the governor's office. So we're really interested, like who is going to be involved. And then again, the what, like what data, are they really just going to try to find available data that answers the questions laid out in the regs? Or are they going to have their own sort of quality assurance framework in addition? And then again, to Harry and I think Julie's question around what about programs that don't meet these qualifications but have significant social value? And a lot of those sit in our wheelhouse. Those are, social work, early education, teacher prep programs, and some of the health professions that are below the nursing degree, right? And so I think we can all agree, like those are things we need. And so the question is, does the credential not have value, or do we not value that work in the labor market? So I think there are some questions to be had about what value we're calculating when we're looking at things like earnings post-credential, right? And then I think there is this question between earnings thresholds or value at, right? Is it okay to get people up to a certain threshold, or is what's more important to take people from somewhere and move them to a newer place? I think in some of our circles, more serious conversations are like, is it okay to take folks from abject poverty to working poverty? Like, is that an agreeable outcome? And I think it really matters who's asking the question and who's making the suggestions too, right? So I also sort of have this question about, will longer academic programs break their programs up to smaller chunks to see if that makes them more manageable? And in that way, they are stackable. So just sort of phrasing that.
Yeah. Well, and thank you for that, and for mentioning stakeholders, because one of the concerns I have is that if you only involve academics at the 2-year level, you're missing a huge swath of providers that exist that would contribute to the methodology, to the data. We already know that most of workforce has been yielded to the 2-year system. That's just ingrained in it's by design. That's the ecosystem, right? But Workforce Pell has a potential to open it up to 4 years, a greater involvement to 4 years. And we simply don't exist on, ETPL lists and other things because by design, that workforce role has always been at the community college level. So we're interested to see how this might change. But thank you.
And that's especially important if you've heard the Insight T that when they first negotiated this legislation, no one wanted to use the ETLP list because people did not feel they were accurate or robust enough because they don't have that broader stakeholder input or validation. So I think that's really important to bring up, Julie.
Jana, you mentioned also here in the chat about prison education programs, that there's going to be an impact there. I think a lot of us don't always think about prisons. It's not the first place we think of when we think about, uh, post-secondary student aid, but they definitely are part of the system. Can you say a little bit more about your concerns there?
Well, yeah, I mean, dual concern. One, that when we saw the restoration of Pell for previously incarcerated individuals, if you've been involved in the rollout, it like hasn't gone particularly smoothly because implementation is where things live or die. And so I think we're equally concerned about how folks in PEP will access these programs if they're really short timelines, but they don't have the same access to either technology or communication tools. Like, do they just not get access to this? So I think we're just sort of worried about the logistics of how this would extend to any PEP program.
But boy, I hope we solve those practical problems because this might be a population, especially the people with GEDs, for whom those non-credit programs could really be a nice bump, given their quite meager opportunities without higher ed. So, I hope people figure out those implementation, which are very serious
Yeah.
and
And then
matter.
you can dive like really into the weeds. Like I've asked people, I'm like, so does ability to benefit still happen here? And does that mean you could only do it for a program that was as long or longer than the GED program? So yeah, I think there are some populations that would include some of our most vulnerable, the lowest income students, students who don't already have a high school diploma, are just as impacted in PEP students. Like, how will they access these things?
So we're nearing the end of our time. I've seen a couple comments from Charles about the importance of having data alignment and interoperability across states in terms of data. Obviously, I think we're all in agreement there. That's important. Um, I don't want to, Charles, if you do want to say a little, if you did want to share a few perspectives there, you also mentioned that there are some states where there has been data submission. I also see Catherine, you've jumped in about the credential value index and burning glasses too. That's something we're all, I think, following closely in the NCRN community. What's going on there, since that's a really significant new source of data that a lot of us trying to kind of figure out how to make the best use of, if we are able to make use of it for some of the research questions that we're asking. Um, so if anybody does want to come off mute, this would be the kind of last opportunity. I can call on anyone or feel free to jump on. Michelle or anybody from Rutgers can also feel free to jump in.
Thanks, Kyle. I see Julie actually just put a really interesting question here. Too bad we only have one minute to tackle this one in the chat. Relationship between credit and non-credit Pell and the coordination there. I mean, that's certainly going to be a challenge too with the limits on Pell grants.
Yeah, we can make that our final question, perhaps, to both Harry and Jinan.
Well, I just say it's more a question of let's bring it back to stackability, Kyle. I have seen some, I can't remember who showed me, so sorry, but preliminary data, because I was concerned, like, are people going to be wasting Pell on workforce Pell since it's still the same total lifetime Pell dollars? And it was like, you'd kind of have to take quite a few of these short-term programs to no avail to like waste away a good chunk of your dollars. So rest easy knowing that. But how will they work on the coordination, articulation between them? Good question. I kind of joke, like in our conversations, a lot of things that people are hoping we get in the workforce Pell implementation doesn't exist for general college. So people like, how will people know about workforce Pell? And a lot of us are kind of, well, how do people know about Pell? So, if that just leads to a larger Pell PSA, like I'm personally pretty here for it. So.
Yeah, I'm actually interested in the flip of that of, we know that it's folks are eligible if they have a bachelor's but not a master's. And so what if they need to return to college or anywhere for retraining? Then if how much of their Pell is their lifetime Pell is used at the onset on average, to know if they would actually be able to afford something at the at the subgraduate level to see the upper end of this maybe.
Well, also, I just like, what if the Pell doesn't cover the cost? Like, then there's still just a gap in affordability. But so Harry, I'd love to get your thoughts.
No, I don't have too much to add. I hope these talent finance programs, which can plug in maybe and fill a lot of these holes if they take off. Now we need more evidence on those as well. But to me, they have a lot of promise in terms of, besides just Workforce Pell on ways of spreading the financing.
Well, we're already a minute over, so I think we will wrap it up and say a big thank you to Jin Ann and Harry. Both of you did an excellent job of breaking down some of the issues and getting, I think, hopefully stimulating some of the research ideas for this community that hopefully folks on this call and other members of the NCRN folks will be reading or watching rather the recording, which we will be posting shortly, I hope, and distributing out to our email list. We'll be able to tackle. So thank you both, and with the NCRN webinar series will return. We're very close to finalizing a topic and a speaker for probably the week before Thanksgiving, and we'll keep going. And it's not too late to also start thinking about our spring conference in May. So if anybody has any ideas or suggestions, always feel free to reach out to me or Michelle. We read every email, of course, and are always looking for new ideas to keep our webinars and conferences relevant to the community. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.